We're here again in the song. It's the Song of Songs. It's a Song of Songs because it's a revelation of Christ, the King of Kings. It's a revelation of His wonderful love. And what happens when anyone sees Him, sees the King, becomes in union with Him, and begins to fellowship with Him. So we're in a section here that the King has been describing the beauty of His wonderful, beloved bride. And item after item of beauty is just displaying and reflecting Himself through her. And then this is so attractive to Him. This is so, just causes Him to want to speak about her more and more. So now we're coming to the 10th item. We've covered 10 items already, or 9 items already, and the beauty that results. There's a life changing that's happening. Love changes people. You know, when we are one with our beloved Christ, we become changed. The world is not attractive to us anymore. We repel sin. We're not part of that way of life anymore. And so in this section, he begins with her feet, and he works his way all the way up to the 10th item right now, which is her hair on her head. You compare with Isaiah 1:6, and it says, "From the sole of your foot to the top of your head, there is no soundness, only wounds and welts and open sores." Before this transforming love of Christ took part of us, this is the way we were. We were just full of sores, and we were just terrible from foot to head. And this is just our previous life apart from Christ. Now there's a tenfold beauty from the feet to the hair. And it's just, we need to ask, how is this change? Is this change continuing in my life? What about my feet? Do they walk the same way that I used to walk? What about my head? Is Christ my head? Do I have His mind? What about my stomach? Am I still feeding on the foods of the world? He's changing us. He's changing our walk. He's changing our appetite. He's changing our thoughts. He's changing us that we would match Him as His bride. So we're in verse 5 of chapter 7. It talks about the hair of your head. And I just like to mention this, that I've been speaking about the description, tenfold ascending description, as words of Christ, but there are others that say this is not Christ speaking, but these are the daughters of Jerusalem as a continuation of chapter 6. And I just like to mention that in case that is your way of looking at this. So the 10th appreciation of the bridal beauty, this beauty is her experience, this beauty is her growth, this beauty is her likeness to Christ. And now we're talking about the covering of the topmost part of the bride and her tenfold ascending beauty. And it's a covering which flows down from her head, and it's her hair. And hair here actually means flowing tresses. They mean long dangling strands which hang down. In 1 Corinthians 11:15, it says, "The hair of a woman is her glory." Yet in this verse, her hair is hanging down, so her glory is hanging down. She's flowing down in humility. Everything that she has, everything that she can, that you see in her, and actually everything you see in our lives, we don't have any boast. The topmost part right now of our reflection of Christ is hanging down. We realize that there's nothing we have gained because of our natural beauty or our strength or our personal glory or anything. It's like in 1 Corinthians 4:7, Paul challenges the Corinthians. He says, "What do you have that you did not receive? And if you received it, why are you boasting about it?" So we have no boast. So the hair is what it was used by loving seekers also when the loving seeker wiped Jesus' feet with her tears, and another loving seeker, or maybe possibly the same one, wiped his feet of ointment that she poured on there. So our glory, our hair, which we have, is for his pleasure and for his glory. So the hair, actually, it denotes our loving consecration to Christ, our submission to Christ, our submission to the will of God, our separation from the world system, from religion and from rebellion. And this, you could see it in Samson's life in Judges 16. Samson's strength was related to his hair. He was a Nazarite, and we all know what happens when his hair was cut. So we need to keep the proper hair before our Lord. And so we are lovers who no longer live to ourselves, but to him who loved us and gave himself for us. And this hair also, in Matthew 10 verse 30, it says all the hairs of our head are numbered by God. So what does this mean? That means that God knows. God is sovereign. He knows every detail in our life. But the thing is now is, with her hair, she knows the sovereignty of God. We want to know the sovereignty of God. Many things happen in our life, or many things happen, and we just can't figure them out. But once we begin to realize that God is on the throne, he's sovereign. There's no accidents. There's no coincidences. But our life is full of meaning. So her union with Christ is entered into the eternal purpose of God, who is sovereign over all. And in this verse he says, your hair, the hair of your head is like purple. So again he uses this word like as a comparison, a type that has some meaning to it. And so at this stage of her obedience and her submission and her maturity, her hair turns purple. And what is purple? Purple actually is the color of royalty, the color of great esteem. In Revelation 1:6, the blood of the Lamb has made us kings, and it's changed our position to one of royalty. Now due to his love working in her, not only changing our position, but her disposition from a slave, from the life of a slave to be kingly, she matches Christ. Her hair matches Christ. She knows and she participates in the authority of Christ. She knows his throne. There's a perfect submission to God and his will. And it's not just her outward actions. It's not like she's just doing things outwardly, but her person. Her hair is growing out of what is within her. God's authority, the throne of his authority, is reflected through her hair. And so she's living in the light of his presence. She's not, it's not just an obedience of outward acts, but there's an attitude of submission within. So, and actually this color purple, we covered it before in chapter 3, verse 10, the riding cushion of the king in his palanquin, in his movement, was purple. So this color purple, we covered the color crimson. Her head was like caramel or crimson, and this was a strong red color, and now we moved to purple. So from crimson to purple. Crimson is actually emphasizing the blood of Christ, and purple emphasizes the authority or the kingly ruling Christ. So the blood brings us to the throne. The more we know the cross of Christ, the more we know the throne of Christ. The more we know the lowly Christ who shed his blood, the more we know the ascended, exalted Christ. And also purple, if you read through the New Testament, it's used in a wrong way by the world. When Jesus was getting ready to be crucified, it says that they put a robe on him, and this robe, the color of it was purple, and this is in Mark 15:20. Also at the end of the Bible, in Revelation 17 and 18, there's an imitation of royalty, and this is the great harlot, or the great whore, and she becomes a false imitation or reproduction of what the bride should be. So she has garments of purple, and so she is corrupt, wearing purple, but inwardly she is full of not purple, but she's full of darkness. So it says the verse goes, the king is your hair is like purple, and then the king is held in your galleries. So we come to the king again. It says the king. And who is the king? He's the royal one. So her hair matches the king. And he's the majestic one. He's the one with sovereign power. And throughout the book, he's been revealed. In chapter 1, verse 4, the king brought the seeking lover into his chambers. And this was the initial stage where in his chamber she began to have revelation of who he was in the secret place. And then it says that the king was sitting at the table. This is a further experience of the king of not only having revelation from him, but the table denotes how the king was supplying her with the riches. And then the king in chapter 3 verses 9 and 11, the king is actually Solomon. He uses the name King Solomon as a king of peace in his chariot. So she knew the king in his movement. So to know him as the king in revelation and experience, actually we could say it's in three areas. One is the area of life. And in Romans chapter 5, it talks about reigning in life and also reigning in grace. And then love. He's a king of love. How does he capture us? By his love. He's constraining us by his love. He's ruling us by love. His love just causes us to drop things and just be attracted and give himself. So this is the king of life, the king of love. And he's also the king of light. When we're in darkness, there's confusion. We don't know which way we're going, what's the next step. But when light comes, it regulates us. It rules us. It governs us. So he's ruling also by light. This is the way he takes us out of things to himself to match, so we can match him. So the king is held, it says. And this is really amazing. How could the king be held? Usually we say that we're held by the king. But she's really secured him. This tenfold ascending beauty has secured him. And so he's, in a sense, you could say he's held like a prisoner who really can't escape. And it's just like he's fastened or tied with the ringlets of her hair. So the king, the Christ, is just caught by him. And he's held. But he's held really not against his will. He's captured voluntarily. He's unable to depart and take his eyes off of her, and he can't move. Now it's come to the point where he cannot move without her. And her beauty, her affections, her character is just Christ. When he looks at her, he sees himself. He cannot, actually the two have become one. He cannot leave her. This union cannot be broken, within, without. Her constitution is just all of Christ. Her nature, her expression just matches him. She abides in him, he abides in her, and they are one. Jesus loved her and attracted her. Now she has captivated him. So who's submitting to who? Who's loving who? The bride and the bridegroom are all of one will, one love, one goal. And when you say this word held, the king is held, it just really denotes a nearness, the nearness to the king. And there's something that is unbroken between them, and it can't be broken. It's a fellowship of love. And she held him in the past to his speaking, to his word of promise. Now this words of promise that he's spoken to her are fulfilled in her, and he's actually detained in her. He's held. Actually, this word held we can go back a little bit through the song and see that it's been there before. In chapter 2, verse 6, he was holding her with his two hands. And we covered this a little bit last week. So he was holding her. But then in chapter 3, verse 4, she lost his presence prior to this, and she was seeking for him and looking for him, and then she found him, and it says, I held him whom my soul loved, and I would not let him go. So she held him in intimate fellowship, and it says she held him. She wasn't holding on to some gift that he gave her, or she wasn't holding on to some past experience which is so precious. No, she was holding a person. And it's kind of like what Jacob said in Genesis 32, I will not let you go. This was after his wrestling all night. So now in chapter 7, verse 5, he's held by her, not by her carnal power or some kind of determination for her own interest or for her own desire. He's held by her beauty. He's held by her affections, and he just cannot get away because he's detained, he's caught by her. Jesus loved her. Now he's captured by her in the same way that she captured him. We were captured, now he is captured. It's just a mutual love. He just sees a reflection of himself in her, and so it says he's held in the galleries. And what are these galleries? They're just ringlets that look like parallel channels of water. And this word was used in chapter 1, verse 17, when it talked about parallel channels or rafters in the house of the king, and they were carved. So they were ornamented interior panels. And so the flowing of bridal beauty in the house is here becoming his dwelling place. She loves him, and he comes and makes his abode with her. The bride and the bridegroom, as in Revelation 21 and 22, they're built together. And these galleries are just water courses. They can be translated water courses. So it's grace upon grace, descending from the heavens, flowing through a course. And she's just receiving this grace, this water of life, without resistance. And this is just a manifold grace of God coming to her. But now what's happening is she's allowing all that she's received of him to return to her. And so she's not keeping it to herself as she did in the past in her immaturity, but now what he's giving to her, what saturated her, what's grace upon grace is what's in her. She's this tenfold beauty is just going to him. And so the conclusion of the tenfold beauty, which is her hair, is related to a flow. It's related to the flowing back to the king for his pleasure, and this really holds him. You know, you can use an example in John chapter 4. There was a Samaritan woman that came to Jesus, and Jesus says, you can have living water flowing in you eternally. And so this was the flowing into the Samaritan. But as Jesus continued to speak, he began to talk about the worship of the Father in the same chapter. So there was a flowing in to the Samaritan, then there was a flowing back to the Father. And this is kind of what happened here. Christ has flowed so many riches of himself into her. Now they're flowing back to him, and they're holding him for his pleasure, for his glory, for his worship. So who you are and who I am, as filled with the riches of Christ, just hold Christ, just seize him. So this flowing ringlets as water courses are just this intimate fellowship, Christ flowing the riches of himself into us, and then we filled and constituted, flowing back to him. He's reached her, he's reached us with the delightful revelations of his person and all the fullness of his riches, and he's disclosed his heart to her. Now her hair, as these flowing galleries of ringlets of channels are flowing back to him with many responses of love, with absolute submission, consecration towards him. So he was her source of the flow, and now he's the goal of the flow. And this is really the song of all songs.